I was watching a news clip the other day, and there was a senator from South Carolina. He wasn't standing at a podium in D.C. or sitting in a high-stakes briefing room. He was on a golf course, looking remarkably relaxed, almost jubilant. While the sky over Tehran was turning a bruised black from oil fires and a strange, oily rain was beginning to fall on 9 million people, this man was casually telling a reporter that the unfolding chaos was the best money ever spent. Most of us grew up with a very specific mental map as how American power works. We're taught about the chain of command, the president, the Joint Chiefs, the State Department, the people with the formal titles who weigh intelligence and debate the heavy cost of war and peace. We're led to believe that a decision to launch a regional war involves a massive, rigorous machine of checks and balances. But then you look at the reality of February 2026. The missiles are flying, oil prices are screaming past $120 a barrel, and the formal institutions look like they're standing on the sidelines watching a script they didn't write. Because it turns out the most influential person in the room wasn't the Secretary of Defense or the director of the CIA. It was this one senator who holds no executive authority, commands no troops, and answers to no one in the chain of command. He didn't use formal intelligence briefings to get his way. He used a golf handicap and a word association game played between holes. He spent 16 years being dismissed as an annoying, crazy uncle by White House staffers, yet while the experts were drafting memos and seeking diplomatic off-ramps, he was whispering in the president's ear at Mar-a-Lago, coaching foreign leaders on how to pitch a conflict like a business deal. That instantaneous realization that the entire apparatus of the U.S. government could be bypassed by a single, persistent golfer with a talent for proximity honestly leaves you a bit stunned. It forces a question that the civics textbooks don't want to answer. If the people with the titles aren't the ones actually making the decisions of life and death, how does this country actually work?
Well, to understand how it actually works, you really have to completely abandon those organizational charts you were taught in high school civics.
Right. The whole, flow chart of power.
Exactly. The traditional understanding of foreign policy, the one taught in literally every introductory political science class, relies on what is known as the bureaucratic politics model.
Okay, let's unpack that term right out of the gate, because bureaucratic politics model sounds a bit dry. What does that actually look like in practice?
Yeah, think of the government like a giant, highly complex machine that is intentionally filled with friction.
Friction, meaning it's supposed to be hard to move.
Right. It is fundamentally designed to be slow. It's designed to be difficult to steer. If the executive branch wants to take a massive action, like launching a regional war, this model assumes that different massive organizations will pull and haul against each other.
Like a tug of war.
Basically, yeah. The State Department pulls toward diplomacy, the Pentagon pulls toward logistical reality and, force protection.
Yeah.
And the intelligence agencies pull toward risk assessment.
Thank you.
They argue constantly. They draft competing memos. They sit in endless National Security Council meetings. And eventually, through all that friction, they produce a balanced, heavily vetted decision.
So it's a system where power is distributed. Right. No one person can just snap their fingers and make something catastrophic happen without, I guess, everyone else signing off on the homework.
The friction is supposed to be the ultimate safety mechanism. But the 2026 Iran war completely, structurally bypassed that friction.
You just sidestepped it.
It wasn't even just ignored. It was rendered entirely obsolete. The entire conflict was driven by informal networks. We are talking about the absolute privatization of foreign policy.
Privatization.
Yes, where the formal executive machinery was sidelined by an individual utilizing golf course access and direct television appearances.
And when you say privatization in this context, you mean a transition from like a government of laws and institutional processes to a government of whispers and personal proximity.
Formal power relies on titles. It relies on statutory authority, legal mandates, a strict chain of command. Actual power, as demonstrated in February 2026, flows through access, relationships, and narrative control.
So Senator Lindsey Graham didn't need to win a debate in the Situation Room.
No. He played psychological games. He would be out on the golf course literally prompting the president with the name Franklin Roosevelt just to elicit the conditioned response about having nothing to fear but fear itself. And he constantly went on television and referred to the president as Reagan Plus.
Wait, Reagan Plus? That sounds like a streaming service or a marketing slogan. It doesn't sound like geopolitical strategy.
It is entirely a marketing slogan, and that is exactly why it works so well. This wasn't about presenting actionable intelligence or troop deployment logistics. It was about managing a leader's ego. It was about shaping a narrative of historic legacy and swagger.
So he's actively working against the established institutions.
Oh, he was combating the traditional foreign policy establishment, what people often call the blob, and the internal White House faction known as the non-entanglement crowd.
And they were just doing their normal jobs.
Right. Those groups were playing by the old rules. They were writing formal memos detailing the objective risks of a massive regional war, assuming that rational fear of consequence would, deter action.
Which is how you would expect professionals to act, right? You present the downside risk, you show the models of what happens to the global economy, and you assume the decision maker will look at that and hit the brakes.
Sure. But Graham understood that institutional warnings were the wrong currency.
The wrong currency.
Yeah. The people with the formal titles were speaking a language the decision maker had no interest in hearing. So Graham bypassed that entire bureaucratic process by simply controlling the information environment the president lived in.
Just bypassing the entire intelligence community.
He replaced cautious, heavily footnoted intelligence briefings with televised praise and private encouragement. He literally coached foreign leaders.
Wait, coached them, like telling them what to say?
Exactly. Specifically Benjamin Netanyahu and Mohammed bin Salman. He coached them on exactly how to lobby the Oval Office. He taught them the psychological trigger words to use.
There is a specific story that perfectly captures how terrifying this dynamic actually is when you get down to the ground level.
Yeah. Oh, the State Department advisor.
Yes. I want you to picture this senior policy advisor at the State Department. He is sitting in a dimly lit office in Foggy Bottom. The air conditioning is humming. The desk is just covered in stacks of vetted intelligence, classified assessments, satellite imagery.
The real work.
The real work. This advisor has spent months, literally hundreds of hours of his life, coordinating with thousands of analysts, drafting a highly nuanced, carefully calibrated de-escalation framework for the Persian Gulf.
Wow.
Right. It is a 200-page masterclass in diplomatic off-ramps.
That is the physical embodiment of the bureaucratic politics model.
Exactly. The system working exactly as designed. So he is sitting there reviewing the final draft, and he glances up at the television mounted on his office wall.
Yeah.
And on the screen is Senator Graham speaking directly into the camera during a Fox News interview. He is looking right down the lens, completely bypassing the anchors, speaking directly to the president, who is presumably watching from the residence.
Just pitching directly to an audience of one.
Exactly. And during a single 10-minute commercial break, that advisor watches months of institutional work simply vaporize.
Because the senator is pitching a surgical strike.
A surgical strike that the Pentagon had already explicitly warned the White House would inevitably lead to full-scale, uncontrollable regional mobilization.
But the facts didn't matter.
No. The senator uses a mix of flattery, alarmist rhetoric, and pure television charisma to sell it. And here's where the chill runs down your spine. Moments after that segment ends, the advisor's phone buzzes. It's an urgent directive from the White House. And the directive isn't based on the 200-page, painstakingly researched report sitting right there on his desk. The directive is based, almost word for word, on the 10-minute television segment he just watched.
That moment, that right there is the exact pivot point where the architecture of the United States government inverted. Yeah. When the ultimate decision maker values televised validation and personal rapport over institutional consensus, the entire formal apparatus becomes entirely decorative.
It's just window dressing.
Literally just window dressing.
It honestly reminds me of a corporate hostile takeover.
So,
well, think about a massive, publicly traded Fortune 500 company. You have a board of directors, a C-suite, risk management committees, legal teams, compliance officers. They are all doing their due diligence, right?
Running the models.
They are running market simulations, drafting quarterly reports, following the bylaws to the letter. But then you have a rogue shareholder. This guy holds no executive title at the company. He's not on the board. He doesn't go to the meetings. But he happens to play tennis with the CEO every single weekend.
And the tennis court is where the actual company is run.
Exactly. While the board is sitting in a sterile conference room on a Tuesday afternoon, looking at pie charts and debating market risks, the rogue shareholder is out on the tennis court on a Saturday morning, convincing the CEO to execute a completely disastrous, highly leveraged merger just for the thrill of the deal.
Yeah, just hyping them up.
Right. And by the time Monday morning rolls around, the CEO has already called the lawyers and signed the preliminary papers. The board of directors is completely sidelined. They are left sitting at a mahogany table, holding their useless risk assessments, realizing they don't actually work at the company they thought they did.
That analogy is flawless because it highlights that this isn't just a quirky anomaly or a one-off mistake. It is a severe systemic structural vulnerability.
It's baked in.
Exactly. Any system built around charismatic, relationship-driven leadership is incredibly susceptible to this exact bypass. The formal institutions fail because their very design assumes the ultimate decision-maker is acting as a rational synthesizer of institutional advice.
They assume someone is actually reading the reports.
They assume the president is sitting at the top of the pyramid, reading all the memos, weighing the pros and cons, and choosing the most logical path. When the decision-maker steps completely outside that pyramid, the pyramid becomes a museum exhibit.
It's just entirely useless. So if the military planners and the intelligence agencies were completely sidelined by this informal network, what happened to the diplomatic track?
Yeah.
Because you would think that before missiles actually start flying, the diplomats would be out there desperately trying to extinguish the fire. But the structural vulnerability you're talking about completely sabotaged the formal diplomatic negotiations regarding Iran's nuclear program, too.
Oh, it didn't just sabotage it. It intentionally corrupted it. The negotiations were handed over to individuals who possessed zero technical expertise, but had immense, unchecked proximity to power.
Right.
You had Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner leading highly sensitive, deeply complex international negotiations without including a single actual nuclear expert on their team.
Let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around the mechanics of this. They are going into a room to negotiate the fissile material limits, centrifuge cascades, and breakout times of a hostile nation-state's nuclear program without a physicist, without an arms control expert.
Not a single one.
I mean, you wouldn't send a real estate developer to perform open heart surgery. You wouldn't ask a golfer to design a suspension bridge, yet we sent people with zero technical vocabulary to dissect a hostile nation's nuclear program. How does that even function logistically in the room?
It functions terribly. But you have to understand that the absence of nuclear experts wasn't an oversight.
It wasn't an accident.
No, it wasn't a scheduling conflict. It was a deliberate feature of the strategy. If you don't have experts in the room, you aren't constrained by objective, verifiable facts.
Ow. So you can just say whatever you want.
You are free to shape the narrative however you want. For example, Witkoff went on Fox News and publicly claimed that Iranian negotiators had actively bragged to his face about having enough 60% enriched fuel to instantly build 11 nuclear bombs.
Which sounds absolutely terrifying to the average viewer. 60% enriched fuel and 11 nuclear bombs. Those are phrases completely designed to trigger immediate existential panic.
The problem is, the claim was a complete fabrication.
He just made it up.
Gulf state diplomats who were sitting at the exact same table in the exact same room during those talks definitively confirmed that no such statement was ever made. The Iranians never bragged about 11 bombs. Witkoff invented the claim out of whole cloth to sell a crisis on cable news.
Unbelievable. So he bypasses the intelligence agencies, goes straight to the media, and drops a completely fabricated nuclear threat. And because he holds the title of Special Envoy, the public naturally assumes he's speaking from a place of classified knowledge.
Right, they trust the title. There. He also explicitly mischaracterized complete statements made by Rafael Grossi, the director of the International Atomic Energy Agency.
Oh, yeah.
They were discussing the Tehran Research Reactor, often referred to as the TRR. Witkoff aggressively presented the TRR to the public as a massive, imminent bomb-making threat.
Okay, I need an ELI 5 here. What is the TRR actually doing? Because if the IAEA is watching it, it's not exactly a secret underground bunker.
No, the Tehran Research Reactor is a fully known facility, and it is an established, verifiable fact within the global non-proliferation community that the TRR was utilized exclusively for developing medicinal isotopes.
Medicinal isotopes, like for hospitals.
Yes, we are talking about materials used for cancer treatments and medical imaging. It is fundamentally not configured to produce weapons-grade plutonium or highly enriched uranium for a warhead.
So it's a medical research facility?
Yeah. To present it as a bomb-making factory requires either a profound, dangerous ignorance of basic nuclear physics or a deliberate, calculated deception.
And when you have that level of ignorance or deception driving the highest levels of American diplomacy, the consequences are just staggering. It created a situation so chaotic that the Omani foreign minister who was mediating these talks actually had to urgently charter a flight to Washington, D.C.
Yes, and he didn't fly all that way to negotiate further.
No, he flew in to frantically clarify to the White House and the American public that Iran was actually offering massive concessions that went well beyond the original 2015 nuclear deal.
Real limits.
Right. The Iranians were putting real, verifiable limits on the table, and the American envoys either didn't understand what they were looking at, or they were actively hiding it from their own government to keep the war narrative alive.
They were hiding it. I mean, while the Omani foreign minister is trying to explain the reality of the concessions, you have this intense, entirely opaque back-channel coordination happening simultaneously. Witkoff and Kushner are coordinating directly with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
And this is where the story crosses the line from geopolitical tragedy into a bizarre spy thriller.
Yes.
Because Witkoff is walking around these negotiations literally carrying a custom-made Mossad pager, a pager personally gifted to him by Netanyahu.
An official American envoy representing the United States government in a multilateral nuclear negotiation is carrying secure communications hardware provided by a foreign intelligence service that is actively pushing for a military strike.
It completely compromises the integrity of the United States. I mean, if I'm listening to this, I'm screaming at my dashboard right now. How does a guy with a Mossad pager get to dictate the failure of a nuclear treaty? Why was he even sent there?
Because the goal was never to secure a treaty. You have to look at the mechanics of the outcome.
Yeah.
When you send negotiators who lack the basic technical vocabulary to understand the concessions being offered,
Right.
who carry foreign intelligence pagers, and who actively fabricate apocalyptic threats on cable news, diplomacy is demonstrably not the objective.
So what was the diplomatic channel actually being used for?
It was utilized strictly as a theatrical device. It was a mechanism designed to run out the clock. The architects of the war needed to create the public illusion that they had tried everything.
So they could say they tried.
Exactly. They needed the talking point that all peaceful options had been exhausted. The failure of the diplomatic talks was entirely predetermined before Witkoff even sat down at the table. The envoys were not sent there to build a diplomatic bridge. They were deployed to meticulously document a pretext for war, while the military option was being finalized in the shadows.
Which brings us to the ultimate catastrophic failure of our formal institutions. If the military advisors were bypassed, and the diplomats were basically actors in a play, where was Congress? Weren't there laws passed specifically to stop exactly this scenario? This forces us to look at the death of the War Powers Resolution.
The United States Constitution and the 1973 War Powers Act were designed for this exact moment. The War Powers Act was born out of the nightmare of Vietnam.
Right.
It was a massive legislative mechanism built specifically to prevent the executive branch from ever again launching massive, unprovoked regional wars without explicit legislative consent. It requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to military action.
And there's a time limit too, right?
Yeah, it forbids armed forces from remaining for more than 60 days without congressional authorization or a formal declaration of war.
It's the ultimate emergency brake. Exactly. But in 2026, the emergency brake was completely disconnected.
There is a story from a former congressional archivist that perfectly illustrates this. He retired shortly after the 2026 conflict began, and his exit interview is just haunting.
It really is.
He described his office down in the basement of the Capitol, lined with historical precedents and legal volumes. And he described the quiet, almost surgical removal of the War Powers Resolution from the active reference shelf.
It literally became a dusty relic.
A dusty relic. He recalled the atmosphere on Capitol Hill on the exact day the missiles began to fly over Tehran. You would expect chaos. You would expect historical weight.
People running through the halls.
Right. But there was no grand debate in the chambers. There was no somber, agonizing vote on the Senate floor where men and women weigh the cost of human life. There was no formal declaration of war.
Instead, this archivist is walking the halls and he watches his younger colleagues, legislative aides, press secretaries, obsessing over narrative control. They are huddled around screens, figuring out social media framing, trying to write the perfect viral post to ride the wave of the news cycle.
Yeah.
They were entirely ignoring the dismantled legal framework sitting in the basement.
The visual of staffers worrying about social media engagement while a regional war is launched illegally is, honestly, the purest distillation of modern governance.
The archivist realized in that moment that constitutional checks and balances were no longer revered as sacred protections. They were treated as annoying obstacles. He called it a constitutional funeral.
A constitutional funeral. Wow.
Congressional oversight was no longer viewed as a solemn duty. It was viewed purely as a partisan weapon to be used only when the other team was in power. This created a total, devastating vacuum of accountability. And that vacuum provided the absolute perfect frictionless system for the architects of war.
And it's vital to understand that the legislative branch didn't just forget they had the power, they actively chose to be bypassed.
It was intentional.
Yes. During the 119th Congress, as the march to war accelerated, resolutions were actually introduced. Specifically, House Concurrent Resolution 38 and Senate Joint Resolution 104.
What were those supposed to do?
These were legislative vehicles aimed at directing the president to remove United States armed forces from hostilities in the Middle East. They were written, they were filed, and they went absolutely nowhere.
They were just buried.
Buried entirely. And this isn't an isolated incident. It represents the culmination of a steady, decades-long erosion of congressional war powers. You can trace the lineage of this abdication back through previous administrations. The Obama administration's actions in Libya, for instance, heavily degraded the expectation of congressional authorization.
So it's been slipping for a while.
Exactly. The 2026 crisis was simply the moment the floor completely collapsed.
But the specific paradox here is what drives you crazy. The exact same politicians who go on television and publicly demand strict, originalist, fundamentalist adherence to the Constitution. The people who keep pocket constitutions in their breast pockets are the very ones actively enabling its bypass when it comes to the most consequential matter of all, life and death. They wield the Constitution as a rigid shield for domestic squabbles over regulations, but they toss it directly into the shredder the moment the missiles are armed. How do they intellectually survive that hypocrisy?
Well, they survive it because of the party politics approach to governance. In the modern era, partisan loyalty entirely overrides institutional duty. You have to look at the immense political utility of a passive Congress.
Political utility?
Yes. From a politician's perspective, taking a vote on a war is the most dangerous thing they could do for their career. If legislators never take a formal, recorded vote to authorize a conflict, their fingerprints are never on the weapon.
It's pure risk avoidance.
Exactly. If the war goes badly, if there are massive casualties, if the economy crashes, they can go on Sunday morning talk shows and avoid all political fallout by claiming they were never consulted. They can say, well, the president acted unilaterally. Right. But if the war is perceived by their base as a victory, they can simply praise the executive, attend the parades, and share in the glory. By abandoning their core constitutional duty to declare war, they eliminate 100% of their political risk.
But that risk doesn't just disappear. It doesn't evaporate into the ether. The risk they avoid in the air-conditioned halls of Washington is shifted entirely to the physical reality of the battlefield.
The real world.
The politicians stay safe while the actual human beings on the ground absorb the kinetic impact. And the grim, undeniable facts of Operation Epic Fury, which commenced on February 28, 2026, completely shatter the sterilized clinical language used in D.C.
The language of war is always designed to obscure the reality of war.
They called it surgical. But let's look at the facts. The strikes did successfully kill Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. But that assassination immediately triggered a massive, sprawling regional conflict. The civilian toll was catastrophic. Over 1,200 Iranian civilians were killed in the initial waves.
And it wasn't just adults.
Oh, and we have to be specific here because the numbers numb you if you don't ground them. That 1,200 includes 175 people, mostly young girls, who were incinerated when a strike hit a girls' school in southern Iran.
A school, not a bunker, not a centrifuge facility.
A school. And while the sky over Tehran was turning black, the global economy violently convulsed. Oil prices instantaneously screamed past $120 a barrel, triggering massive inflation and logistical nightmares globally. And the mechanics of the actual military engagement were a bizarre, terrifying mix of eras.
What do you mean by mix of eras?
The U.S. military was utilizing Eisenhower-era B-52 bombers, massive, lumbering Cold War relics, flying alongside cutting-edge experimental technology. And in the naval theater, for the first time since World War II, a United States submarine actually fired a torpedo and sank a vessel.
The sheer scale of the kinetic destruction across multiple domains, air, land, sea, and economics, is entirely impossible to reconcile with the phrase surgical strikes.
Let's focus on the technological reality for a second, because the tactical realities of this conflict revealed massive, terrifying vulnerabilities and absurd economic asymmetries. You read about the drone war, and it breaks your brain. Explain the economics of what happened with the ill-you-cheese drone.
The drone war in 2026 proved that the era of uncontested American technological supremacy is over. The U.S. deployed what was known as the ill-you-cheese drone. The unit cost of the ill-you-cheese is roughly $35,000.
Which, in military terms, is the price of a paperclip.
It is remarkably cheap. But what is truly staggering is that the LUTs is literally a reverse-engineered carbon copy of Iran's own Shahed-136 drone.
Really? We just copied theirs.
Yes. The U.S. military actually nicknamed the LUCA as the boomerang because we were essentially throwing their own cheap technology back at them. But the asymmetry cuts both ways. The first American casualties of the entire war did not occur on a grand battlefield. They occurred when a cheap, low-flying drone penetrated the roof of a U.S. command post in Kuwait.
A command post that I assume cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build and secure.
It was heavily fortified against ground attacks, protected by blast walls, heavily armed guards, but it was entirely vulnerable from above to a piece of technology that costs less than a base model Honda Civic.
Dang.
A multi-million-dollar defensive perimeter rendered useless by a $35,000 flying lawnmower.
And the technological chaos wasn't limited to enemy drones. There was a friendly fire incident that is almost hard to comprehend. Detail what happened with the Kuwaiti F-18.
Right, so the airspace was incredibly congested, communication protocols broke down, and in the sheer chaos, a single Kuwaiti F-18 fighter jet, an Allied aircraft, mind you, locked onto and shot down 3 United States F-15EX fighters.
There, let's look at the math and the mechanics of that. An ally shoots down 3 of our most advanced fighter jets. What is the cost of an F-15EX?
An F-15EX costs approximately $150 million each.
So in a matter of seconds, due to a breakdown in coordination with a partner nation, nearly $500 million of state-of-the-art American air power is erased from the sky.
Just gone.
And the pilots, this is the reality. You hear the term surgical strikes bandied about by men in suits on cable news, and it sounds so clean. It sounds like a medical procedure. It implies precision, perfect control, and 0 collateral damage. But a bombed girls' school is not surgical. $500 million of friendly fire is not surgical. Oily rain falling on 9 million people in a metropolitan city is not surgical. It is visceral, chaotic, uncontrollable devastation. And it exposes that the entire foundational premise of the operation, the decapitation strategy, was fundamentally flawed from the start.
The decapitation strategy is effectively a fire-and-forget missile applied to human geopolitics. It is an incredibly naive way to view the world. It assumes that by eliminating the head of state, in this case Khamenei, the entire hostile regime will instantly, cleanly collapse, and that a friendly, democratic, pro-Western government will just, organically emerge from the rubble and thank us.
Like cutting the head off a snake. They assume the body just dies.
But a nation-state is not a snake. It is a complex web of power centers, military factions, and religious institutions. This strategy was executed without any viable succession plan and without acknowledging the actual physical reality on the ground. There was absolutely no organized, effective, armed opposition movement inside Iran ready to step in and take administrative control of the country. Eliminating the supreme leader didn't create democracy. It simply created a massive, violent power vacuum. And history tells us exactly what fills a power vacuum: internal chaos, factional civil war, and immediate external retaliation.
And that chaos didn't stay contained to Iran for even a week. It immediately bled outward. The map expanded instantly. And the domino effect of this unchecked, unaccountable power meant that the exact same informal network, the same senator, the same TV pundits who pushed for the Iran war, immediately began pushing to expand the conflict globally. The war became a franchise.
Once the bureaucratic friction is gone, there is nothing to stop the momentum. Senator Graham immediately pitched what he called Operation Semper Fi. He advocated for a massive bombing campaign in Lebanon.
Lebanon now.
Yeah, and to sell it to the public, he explicitly invoked the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing, deliberately manipulating decades-old historical trauma to justify a completely new front.
So we are bombing Iran, and now he wants to bomb Lebanon. And then he looks at the other side of the globe. He simultaneously targeted Cuba, going on television and publicly demanding a forceful end to the Cuban government.
And while that rhetoric is flying, actual operational movements are happening in Africa. At the exact same time, Israel began formal negotiations with Somaliland to establish a brand new military base in the Horn of Africa, specifically designed to launch strikes against Houthi rebels.
If you were looking at a map, this sounds like sheer insanity. How does a targeted, supposedly surgical strike on Tehran suddenly spiral into establishing military bases in Somaliland and calling for regime change in Havana? It feels like the map is just unrolling endlessly across the table, and the architects of the war are just throwing darts blindfolded.
Because moving military operations into the Horn of Africa carries a level of geopolitical risk that is difficult to overstate. You really have to look at the granular reality of that region. It is already incredibly fragile.
It's a powder keg.
Essentially a powder keg waiting for a match.
Yeah.
Somalia is locked in a prolonged, bloody, existential fight against the al-Qaeda affiliate al-Shabaab. Right next door, Sudan is being torn apart by a brutal civil war that has entirely displaced 13 million human beings. It's a humanitarian nightmare.
And into that nightmare, they decide to drop a new military base.
Establishing an Israeli military base in Somaliland ignites an incredibly complex web of proxy alignments. It isn't just about the Houthis. You have the United Arab Emirates and Israel actively supporting Somaliland's independence and military integration.
Okay.
On the other side, you have Turkey and Qatar vigorously backing the central recognized government of Somalia in Mogadishu, injecting advanced Israeli military assets into this specific hyper-fragile tinder docks, risks igniting a sprawling, uncontrollable multi-front war across the entire African continent.
But again, I come back to the why. Why do they want to expand it? We haven't even secured the first theater of war, and they're opening 3 more. What is the mechanical logic driving this?
It is the textbook definition of mission creep, and it is entirely fueled by the deliberate absence of defined victory conditions. When a war is launched without formal congressional authorization, without a legal framework, and without a clear, achievable diplomatic goal, the objective automatically defaults to unconditional surrender.
Which sounds great in a movie.
It sounds great in a World War II documentary, but unconditional surrender is a concept from Total War, where you march into the enemy's capital and raise a flag over their parliament. In modern asymmetric regional conflicts involving proxies and drones, an adversary rarely, if ever, formally surrenders.
There's no treaty to sign.
There is no battleship Missouri to sign a treaty on. Therefore, because there is no mechanism for surrender, the war never officially ends. It simply expands.
It just keeps growing.
The logic dictates that if the enemy hasn't surrendered, it must be because they are getting help from someone else. So the war expands until it encompasses every single perceived adversary on the global map. Lebanon, Cuba, the Houthis in Yemen, factions in Somalia. They all suddenly become justifiable, necessary targets under the endlessly expanding umbrella of the initial unauthorized conflict.
Which brings us to the most crushing, enraging realization of all of this, the accountability gap. I want to share the story of a veteran from a small town in South Carolina. This young man enlisted in 2024. He was deeply moved by the televised speeches. He heard the exact rhetoric we've been talking about, the soaring language about defending Western civilization, protecting freedom, and ending the Iranian threat once and for all. He believed the narrative, and he offered his life to the state.
As millions have before him.
Fast forward 2 years to 2026. He is sitting in a brightly lit, sterile VA clinic. He is dealing with permanent, life-altering physical injuries sustained in the Gulf. And there, playing on the television in the clinic waiting room, is the exact same senator from his home state, the man who orchestrated the war. But the senator isn't talking about Iran anymore.
No, he's moved on.
He is effortlessly, almost joyfully pivoting to a brand new geopolitical threat. He's talking about Cuba, he's talking about Lebanon.
Just selling the next deal.
Yes. The senator doesn't acknowledge the massive strategic failures of the decapitation strategy. He certainly doesn't acknowledge the human cost, the 1,200 dead civilians, or the broken soldiers sitting in clinics just like that one. He is just on to the next target. And the veteran sitting in that plastic chair realizes, in that exact moment, that the war he bled for was nothing more than a series of tactical talking points for the men in suits. It was a game played on a golf course.
Devastating.
But for him, it was a permanent, irrevocable, physical transformation of his reality. His body is forever broken for a war that the architect has already forgotten. This is the ultimate, sickening accountability gap. The architects of the conflict fail upward into book deals and primetime slots, and the participants are left to literally pick up the pieces of their lives.
And you must understand the psychology of the architects here. There are absolutely no consequences for them, and they know it. They revel in it. Senator Graham was actually asked about accountability. He was asked about the famous Pottery Barn Rule.
You break it, you own it rule.
Right, the geopolitical concept popularized during the Iraq War, meaning if you destroy a country's infrastructure and government, you are responsible for rebuilding it. Senator Graham explicitly dismissed the rule on the record. He stated, "You break it when it's a threat."
You break it when it's a threat. Stop.
That is a total, unabashed abdication of responsibility for the aftermath of military action. It is the purest expression of the fire and forget mentality. You drop the bomb, you declare the threat neutralized on television, and you completely ignore the decades of fallout, insurgency, and human suffering that follow.
Unbelievable.
Furthermore, the entire narrative that the American public demanded this war, that there was broad consensus for action, was completely manufactured by these informal networks. Polling data from the National Iranian-American Council, the people who actually have family in the region, who understand the stakes deeply, show that 61.6% of Iranian Americans actively favored diplomacy and strongly opposed military intervention.
So the people closest to the issue didn't want it. The intelligence agencies warned against it. The Pentagon said it would cause a regional meltdown. But none of that mattered. It is a dark, brutal irony. The people bearing the ultimate physical cost of this bypass, the soldiers sitting in the VA clinics, the 175 children incinerated in a school in southern Iran, the countless regional workers caught in the economic and kinetic crossfire, have absolutely zero voice in the decision-making process.
Zero.
Meanwhile, the single most influential voice in the entire country, the man whispering in the president's ear on the golf course, faces zero physical risk, zero economic hardship, and absolutely zero political risk.
It is critical, absolutely essential, to understand that this accountability gap is not a glitch in the system. It is not an accident of history. It is deliberately structurally designed.
It's working as intended.
Yes. The politicians who advocate for war, the massive defense contractors who fund their political campaigns, and the media ecosystems that amplify their alarmist rhetoric are entirely physically and economically insulated from the costs of the conflicts they initiate. They live in a different reality. Furthermore, Senator Graham's specific political base processes this conflict through a strict, uncompromising patriotic frame.
Explain how that frame works mechanically to protect him.
This patriotic frame is an incredibly powerful psychological tool. It automatically rewards aggression, dominance, and the projection of force. It severely punishes hesitation, nuance, or any reliance on traditional diplomacy, framing those actions as weakness or appeasement. Because he operates within this media and political ecosystem, he is structurally guaranteed to face absolutely no electoral consequences for the devastation he helped orchestrate.
Wow.
He gives his base the emotional satisfaction of perceived strength, and they give him absolute immunity from the consequences of his actions.
The core reality laid bare by the 2026 Iran war is inescapable. The entire apparatus of democratic oversight, the collective weight of military intelligence, and the depth of diplomatic expertise were successfully and completely overridden by informal access and narrative manipulation. The system is functioning exactly as it was designed for those who hold power. The individuals who bear no cost have already moved on. The next war is already being planned, and the next school that gets bombed simply doesn't know it yet.